We are talking about implicit and explicit narrative this week on Gaming the Podcast. How are the two related? How are they separate? And how, in particular, can the implicit side of a game's narrative cause within us some of the most powerful and memorable reactions? My name is John Robertson and I'll be joined shortly by Stace Harmon. Before that though, just a quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter. We are at Indie by Design. We're also at Indie by Design on all other social media networks. And you can also visit our website, indiebydesign.net, where you can check out and pick yourself up copies of the video game books that we write, create and publish. Those were quite explicit calls to action right there, so maybe I should work on making them a little more implicit next time.
Explicit and implicit narrative in video games. And that is, broadly defined, I think that's the stories that we're told through video games and the stories that we infer for ourselves. And this is going to cover several different games and genres. But by way of an example of what we'll be talking about, there is, and there's some spoilers for Last of Us Part 2 for anybody that hasn't played it yet. There is a point in The Last of Us where Joel has just been killed. And Ellie goes into his house to look for some belongings and specifically to find his gun. And she picks up that gun and there's discussion around what that means. She's talking about what that means to her. But what I took from that was there was a moment there where as soon as Ellie gets that gun, I knew instinctively, without too much thought, that I would not use that gun throughout the entire game unless it was to kill people that had killed Joel. And furthermore, I wouldn't kind of engage with some of the game systems surrounding the weapons. Like, I knew that I wouldn't upgrade that gun. I wouldn't tinker with it, at least on my first playthrough, because that's my first narrative playthrough. Subsequent playthroughs, I've upgraded it fully and all the rest of it. But there's a moment where there's a story that you're being told, there's events that's happening, and then there's things that I took from that and everything that I knew about Ellie and the situation from both the second game and the first game. And it's a thing that games are very well placed to do and can be incredibly powerful in doing, but perhaps one that we don't talk enough about, or perhaps isn't as acknowledged as it would be. Would you say? Is it a thing that's not there isn't enough discussion about in terms of critical assessment or in the way that we talk about video games?
Yeah, possibly. Although I think actually it's probably happening all of the time without people kind of realizing it, because I think I'd go so far as to say that there's no game because of the form of video games, the interactive element. There is no game in. I don't think there's a game that exists that doesn't have an implied narrative. And often when people are talking about it, they're often talking about implied narrative, but they're not using the words implied narrative. They're not like labeling it as such. But which
is where this notion of like stories that we make up for ourselves, that we infer for ourselves, comes from, right? Like, so
because so I think so no game is without implied narrative, I would suggest, because if you're engaging with something that's then reacting to you, and you're engaging in something looking for a reaction, which is what a game is, doesn't matter whether that's a board game, video game, any game, word game, like whatever, you're doing something to seek to try and cause a reaction in order to progress the game. And whenever you're causing a reaction to something within something, then you're going to have a response to that. An emotional response, a response of action, like you're talking about in The Last of Us, and therefore you've created a story. Like there's an input, there's a reaction, there's an action that comes from that. There's an emotional change. Like that's always implied narrative all the time. Like it doesn't matter whether that's The Last of Us, if that's Tetris, if that's Street Fighter, if that's Gran Turismo. There's a narrative going on all of the time.
But we're not great, it seems, at talking about that, because often the question might be, so what's the story of this game? And unless it's an explicit narrative in those games, those typically sort of cinematic games like Last of Us, like Tomb Raider, like Grand Theft Auto, the answer might typically be, oh, well, there isn't one. Like, what's the story of Fortnite? Oh, well, there isn't one. But you're not just suggesting with it, but you're stating that is just wholly untrue. It's just not a story that is that we're familiar with. It's a story that's happening on a different level.
That's wrong, but it might just be wrong on a semantic level. It might be that people do agree that, like, yes, there's an emotional arc to these things, but they're just not labeling it as story, because story we tend to think of as plot and character. So they might not be labeling it as such. But I think, like, I don't think many people would suggest that there isn't an emotional arc to those things.
Sure.
Like, there's an emotion which I would suggest, which I would definitely state is story, an emotional progress from one emotion to the next, and then potentially back again. You know, peaks and troughs, etc. That's what a story is. That is what a film or a game or a writer is trying to have you go through. The elements on screen, the characters reacting to each other, the actions happening, Ellie finding the gun, whatever. That in and of themselves, they're just tools. They're just tools to make the player or the viewer have an emotional reaction. Like, it's the emotion that is the story. It's just whatever the way that they draw that emotion from you. That's just a tool. That's a narrative tool. So yeah, like, and then the tool in more abstract games is a bit harder to visualize or to notice that you're actually being influenced by it. Like in puzzle games, you know, flipping a block around to try to put it into the right space, and then feeling reward or frustration that it doesn't come, or tension because it's coming up to the limit and you're going to lose. Like, and then, you know, the relief and the sense of joy when you finally do get that block that goes in and removes all the blocks. That's a story. Like, you've gone through an emotional arc to the story. Like, the actual responses that your subconscious being is going through is the same ones as in The Last of Us or in a movie. It's just that the stimulus that's causing that isn't readily identified as a story, but your body is reacting in the same way. You're still scared, or you're still sweating, or whatever responses that you're having. You're still sad, or you're still disappointed. Whatever, the responses are the same.
And sometimes that's often, perhaps that's more powerful because it's something that you are creating or inferring yourself. So I like something like survival games are particularly good at this. And they're not always the most polished of experiences. They're not always a game that you would look at and say that something like, I mean, going back to DayZ is something that the last real, like, I spent hundreds of hours in that game. But more recent things like Rust and Valheim, there are stories there that emerge and that we engage with, even if there's no explicit narrative, even if there's no, and then one day the world ended and then the zombies came and this is what happened in DayZ. That doesn't need to be there. And yet that I remember going through, there's stories, you know, because some of the most important stories, or all the stories that come from games like that, are ones that the players write themselves and experience for themselves, and that they're the things that get told when they're telling it to their friends. Oh, this thing happened the other day in X game and it was crazy because of X, Y, and Z. But that wasn't, like, what the designer has done there, or the developer has done there, is create a framework for those things to happen, a breeding ground for those things to happen, but not and then I'll have a jump scare here, and there's no beats, there's no story, like authored story beats in those.
Yeah, so I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's the players of the games have wrote those stories themselves. I don't know if I had to describe it as that, because the players can only write the stories based on the blocks that the developers give them, because those are the only things you can react to. So in Valheim or Rust or whatever, the stories are still built around the tension of not having resources, or the tension of being attacked by someone else. So the stories are still written, a framework that's structured and constrained and presented by the developers. It's just that there's a kind of more randomized set of reactions that you can have, because the game isn't set up, because, you know, the player doesn't know, or the developer doesn't know exactly what the player is going to come up against all the time. So there is a kind of randomized element that the players are working against, but working within. But the players are still constructing their stories through only the things that the that the developers give them.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it's more. Yeah, it's more. Perhaps what I'm saying is more accurately summed up by saying the specific narrative of any given story or playthrough. Because I agree that the building blocks have to be there. You can't tell a story about going to the moon in Valheim or in DayZ because that is not a thing that exists in the game. But nonetheless, my narrative of playing a game like that will be different from playthrough to playthrough, but it will also be different compared to other people that play the game in a different way. So again, for example, with DayZ, I did not, in the hundreds of hours that I played that game, I did not kill a single person. I'm not sure. I think I may have fired my gun at people in like warning, but I did not kill a single person. There are people whose entire experience was defined by hunting down and killing other people. So those narratives are entirely created by the individual players. But sure, yeah, the stories the story of what you want to do is defined by
I suppose
by what's there.
I suppose it would be described as the stories that we create ourselves in those are created by the gameplay mechanics that the game has. So
the game facilitates a certain
and I think the skill in those sort of games is the authorship of those sort of games comes from the designer being clever in providing the right story sort of gameplay blocks and therefore potential story outlets that melds together nicely to create a certain tension that is shared between most players. How people react to that tension is another thing, but you are reacting to the same sort of story blocks as everyone else because there's only a certain number of things you can do in the game, so everything is built around that. But I think that idea of here's some gameplay mechanics and and then it's up to you how you react to that. I mean, not only in DayZ, although that was maybe one of the earlier games to do it, but in games that are super popular now, the games shared by a lot of people. Like I'm thinking like Battle Royale games, especially Fortnite, Apex, Call of Duty, Warzone, and whatever. You're in. Everyone's sharing the same sort of core elements there. Like you want to be the last team to survive. The circle is going to get closer and closer to the final point of the final survival zone. As time goes on, you've got guns to shoot. You've got movements to make that either take you away from enemies for safety or move you closer to them or whatever. Certain characters will have different skill sets depending on what game it is. If it's Apex, you might have a healer, or someone else might be a sniper, or someone else might be able to move really quickly compared to everyone else, or whatever. And the implied narrative of those games is so incredibly strong, and I think that's why those games are so popular. It's not because people enjoy shooting, although they do. I'm not saying that they don't, but I would argue that the reason those shooting games elevate themselves above other shooting games is because the potential for stories is so incredible, because you've got each individual, say if there's 100 players in the game, then you've got 100 different stories, but then some of those might be 4 or 5 of those might be localized to within your group. So you might be in a group of 4 or a group of 5 or a group of 3 in Apex. So there's individual stories, and there's a little story of your group of 3, but then there's a story of the whole map as well, everyone. So there's a single story happening, and then all these little stories happening. And what you can infer from, or what can be implied through that is absolutely crazy. Like the emotional arc that we were talking about before, the tension and the fear and the reward and the joy and, the surprise and whatever. All of that stuff is so incredibly strong in those games, and like all the gameplay mechanics just work brilliantly in forcing those things upon you. Like the simple idea of the map getting smaller and smaller and smaller forces the story to change all the time, because it means that if someone just wants to be a sniper and the story of their entire existence in that game is that I will sit here and snipe whoever comes close to me, that's a flat, boring story. But you can't. You have to engage in a new story all the time, because you have to move towards the enemy. You just have to. It doesn't mean you have to be more aggressive. You might move and hide, but you can't just sit there and have that emotional stability of knowing no one's ever going to find me here and I'm going to be safe. until the end. But you can't do that. You have to engage in progressing your personal story forwards. Like, you just can't. And then if you're a healer, or if you're a sniper, or if you're a frontline fighter, immediately before you've even begun playing the game, your story is different. Like, the story that I'm about to go on is going to be wildly different.
You're choosing different parameters, aren't you? You're choosing different parameters in which to experience that story, because by choosing a certain class, by choosing a certain avatar that has certain expectation, not just from you but from other people around you. Like, there is an expectation that you will act in this way if you are these
and also how people react to you as well, like how your teammates will react to those. So you picking the healer is changing the sniper's story because they've got something different to react to. If you'd picked a sniper as well, then they would react to you differently. So so all these
in those cases, so then what people are seeking out, what we're seeking out through playing those games isn't the obvious headline thing of domination and winning and being top of that list and being the last person standing or team standing or whatever it might be. It's really, we're just seeking out the interaction along the way, because you can play a game and never win. I mean, even to take it to something like Fall Guys, you can play a game and never win. But you will still keep playing that game because of the stories that happen in the moment as you're playing it, rather than the looking back and, oh, I won that. You can win. Well, not arguably. You can certainly win and have a less interesting story than in another game where you played, even in the very next round, where you play and have a much more interesting story, but you got knocked out halfway through.
Yeah,
you came mid-league or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say that it speaks to the quality storytelling of Battle Royale games, that the vast majority of people either never win or win incredibly rarely, and yet they still play the game all the time. So they are playing it at that. That's evidence that they're playing it for more than just simply win-lose. Like, that's surely, otherwise they just move on to a different game, wouldn't they? Like, surely. But the millions of players that play these games are not winning regularly. Like, they're just not. The way that the number of people that win each game mean that that's impossible. It's just mathematically impossible. Most people are not winning all the time, or even most winning 50% of the time, or even 10% of the time. They're just not.
Yeah, and that's and yeah, absolutely. And then combining those two things, because I'm thinking in terms of like streamers and people who are watched by other people, people who play something like Apex or any of those Battle Royale games, and have an audience in doing so. Through doing so, the audience doesn't want the story of that game to be constantly that this streamer always wins. They come first every single time. I don't think that it's more interesting. There's more emotional highs if you just miss out, or that time when you dropped in and, oh my goodness, this person who's been on a win streak of 10 just got knocked out within the first 5 seconds. Like, those are the stories that endure, rather than the, oh yeah, they won. They won 15 times in a row by using the same tactics every single time. They were a sniper. They didn't do anything. That's not. It's like, that's the results are there, but that's not a appealing story.
Yeah, I think that might be interesting from a purely educational level. Like, if you're saying how do I improve in Fortnite or whatever, you might watch that. But that's probably not a streamer you're going to go back to and watch after you've been educated to the point where you needed to be educated too. Like, you're not going to go back to that educational institution essentially for entertainment, are you? Like, people go to university to learn and whatever, but they don't then just go back to university to have the lecture part of the university to have a good time, do they? Like, they move on to they do something else.
And that explains, like, Hades is, well, explains, but that's another way for me to look at Hades, because that is, I can, if I want to, go on a winning streak of just defeating Hades at the end of that game time and time again, but that's not where the interesting stories come from. And that's not the reason I play that game. I'm not doing that to win. I'm not doing that to get a big number on the times achieved, the times that you've escaped. I'm doing it to experience a different thing each time I play, to mix up the variables, to see, oh, I was so super close on that. How do I tweak that? What are the interesting bits here, rather than just, the end result is you win. That's not why we play. No. And
I think actually games, they have a different means of implying narrative, generating implicit narrative that other mediums don't. Most other mediums, some do, tend not to have, which is the interactive element. So because you're interacting with something, like I said before, like you're making a story each time through that connection, through that interaction. So I think because games are all about interaction to progress them, I would go so far as to say that if you want a quality, memorable narrative, as defined by kind of like an emotional progress of emotions through time, then you really need to think about what do you actually want your players to be doing in this game? Like, what are the actions that the players can take? What are the things that the players are going to use to imply meaning and narrative through their actions? You need to think about that, what the players are doing, probably before you decide, okay, the plot of the game is this. Because, to use, like, The Last of Us is a great example of that, I think, where the actions that you take really match with the plot and the theme of the world. To use another Naughty Dog example, Uncharted is a bad example of it, because what you're doing in the world, climbing, jumping, shooting stuff, shooting a lot of stuff, shooting like 5,000 human enemies and killing them. Like, there's a certain narrative that we're taking from Nathan Drake there, that he's a certain kind of individual who is prepared to kill in genocidal numbers to get what he wants. But then in the cutscenes, the story,
which is often something that doesn't belong to him.
That's it's just like some ancient thing that should probably be in a museum or something. But so he's this killer, this maniacal killer in the world. And what else could, if the cutscenes are taken away, what else could you possibly imply from his character, other than that he is just basically another space marine, but in a dirty old top rather than giant armor?
Yeah, well, that's what's inferred, though, isn't it? What's implied through his actions is also that, but what we're explicitly told.
Exactly. And this is why I think that there needs to be more effort put on what is the player actually doing and what are they going to be implying through their actions, versus what are you telling them that they should be thinking. Because in Uncharted, what you're implying for your actions is that he's a killer and he'll kill her, and they might be bad guys or whatever, but whatever, he's still killing loads of people. Like, he's still doing what most people would be considered like an evil thing. But then you're told he's great. Like, you're told he's really lovable and he's a bit of a rogue and he's like a family man. And it's like, what? Like, he's just killed like loads of people's children just there. Like, what?
But two of those three things match. Yeah, absolutely. And two of those three things match up in that situation, I think, because the thing that the player infers from what they're doing, if they think about it beyond what they're being explicitly told, is that the thing that's being implied through Nathan Drake's actions by Naughty Dog, by the design of the game. The implication is this guy is a maniac. This guy will do whatever he wants. But so those two things are in agreement. What's implied and what you infer, so long as you don't just listen to the explicit narrative, are the same thing. It's like, well, my actions, like, you're implying that I'm a crazy person for the number of people I'm killing. I'm also inferring that same thing, because how could I not be? But explicitly through cutscenes and through playing Crash Bandicoot with his girlfriend, you're being told that that's not.
Yeah, it's just down to earth, lovable guy.
Like, no PTSD in sight.
Yeah,
it's all good.
And the Uncharted one, I feel a bit bad because everyone bashes on Uncharted for similar reasons.
It's an obvious, like, it's a known thing. Yeah, right? Like, it's a joke.
But I mean, in explaining the importance of why implicit narrative plays such a huge role, like, it is an obvious example.
Particularly when Naughty Dog also have created The Last of Us, which is a very good example of these things that we're talking about, where those things match up. So it's like,
because like everything you're being told in that game does match with the potential stories that can be inferred through what's being implied in the gameplay mechanics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But in Uncharted, it's not like that.
And that is a reason why, as well as the killing stuff, as well as the killing in The Last of Us, it's an example that I often bring up with why things click together so nicely for me in The Last of Us, because that thing that we all do in video games, where you search every cupboard, every drawer, and that's even if they're in somebody else's property or home, you still do that. Like, the game has put things there for you to pick up.
Yeah.
But often that is at odds and clashes quite egregiously with the narrative of, oh, well, yeah, you're in your friend's house, but you're just taking everything, or you've gone into this random place and the first thing you do is loot it. And that is solved if you like, by The Last of Us, by the characters explicitly stating, like Bill, for example, in the first game, explicitly states, grab what you need, I'll wait here while you collect your supplies and whatever. Because it's very obvious that you're going to go for a poke around, even if there was nothing to pick up. Joel in that situation wouldn't be going around Bill's gaff looking for stuff, even if the designers haven't put anything there to pick up. You're still taking that action. And you're stopping the story effectively. Bill's saying, we got to go. And you're like, oh, yeah, just hang on a minute, I'm going to have a look around. So by explicitly acknowledging that, it fits together. The feeling that it creates is like, okay, that feels good. It's not jarring, is the perhaps most importantly. It doesn't jar you out of this thing of, yeah, sure, we've got to go and save the world or do X, Y, and Z. But before we do that, I'm just going to go and pick up, these collectibles and some resources.
Yeah, well, I think this is where authorship in games comes from. Gameplay designers, narrative designers, writers should all be working closely together all the time from the very outset of the game, because otherwise these things come in conflict with each other very easily. But in that example you've just said, the narrative design of the overall world and the consistency of the overall world, and the writer, the detail of the characters and the actions being taken, and then the gameplay designer of designing what is possible for the player to do, they all fit. So then the explicit narrative and the implied narrative work together, because the possible implications and the things that are possibly inferred by the player will all match what the narrative designer and the writer have already created as an overarching dome. Everything that's the player creates exists within the dome made possible by the game mechanics, because those are the only actions you can take. But everything that can be created in that dome fits with the wider, what's already there, what the writers and the narrative designers have already placed there. But that doesn't happen in Uncharted, because the things that they've placed there are at odds with what you can do.
Yeah. And that's why and it can be unsatisfying, because there are many examples beyond Uncharted where this happens, and there's a list of games which we don't need to go to list all of the worst offenders, but that is why I think as a player, if you're playing a game and something feels off, or it just seems a bit dumb, or this is as if, I think that is, all of those are examples of that explicit narrative and the implied narrative either clashing, or the inferred narrative, what you're taking from it, what you are reading of that situation and what you're being told, clashing and being two different things. And that's not always obvious. It's not always obvious why something doesn't work, why it's well, that's just stupid. It's that can be why, because there's this clash.
Yeah, and this is when you get people who are they'll be annoyed with some sequels, for example, where it'll be oh, well, my version of that character wouldn't do that.
Canon.
And now I don't always think that's necessarily the writer's fault or the narrative designer's fault. Next, I think players maybe need to be a bit more open with interpretations of what characters might or might not do. But sometimes it is the writer designer's fault, because they have opened the door to inferences and implications that they never that should never have been opened. That they've made it too fuzzy, or they've made it well, again, to use a Nathan Drake example, they've opened the door for some people to infer that Nathan Drake is a blood crazed killer, and then when he does something else, it's well, that's not what my version of Nathan Drake would do. Why is he doing that thing? And whilst on one level, yes, players shouldn't feel like their version of the character is the be all and end all, but in some cases, that version of the character should never have been allowed to live in anyone's mind ever. If the designers, that at some point they've opened the door for this character to be created in people's minds that never should have been created.
It can even be more explicit than that as well, can't it? Because you can have a game where there are at least two, more than two, multiple different endings that go in different directions, and that have certain characters alive or dead, or that have the state of the world in this way or that way. And then when you do a sequel to that, you have to pick often. I mean, perhaps you can get around that in a different way. You can set it in the far distant future or whatever it might be, in another planet, whatever. But often you have to pick then, as the narrative designer or the game designers, you have to pick which version you're going to go with. And so you are the people that you may have won over in the first instance by allowing them to tell their story and derive certain things from that narrative that you've provided. you then have to isolate because you have to pick a way forward and then say, well, this is canon. I think maybe the Metro games, I remember that happening with that. It's like you have to go in one direction or another.
Well, I think that's dangerous when you're telling players you can be whatever you want. You can be a goodie, you can be a baddie, like Mass Effect.
Until the sequel.
Like, yeah, like you can be the renegade, you can be the paragon, you can be whatever. But then at a certain point in the trilogy or at a certain point in the canon, you're saying, actually, it's this one. Like, so all those things that you implied through your decisions, or all the things that you made all the direct decisions you made, and all of the things you implied through those decisions, or the responses that the game gave you from those decisions, are actually wrong. It's like, well, why did you, like, if you're gonna have multiple endings and then you want a sequel to that involving the same characters, you should probably not make your multiple endings different characterizations of that character, because you got to choose one character eventually to start the next game with. So how are you going to do that? Like, that's not going to work, is it?
No. And and that is a trap that can be that people can fall into. I think from another more sort of positive take on that, or there's a different way in which that can manifest, which is that you can have games like Dishonored, for example, where there is an explicit narrative, and then there is a way that you interpret that narrative and that you play in. And maybe you're deciding to play in a, say, stealth, high chaos, where you kill everybody kind of way, not because of the narrative, not because you're choosing to tell the story in that way, but just because you really enjoy the game mechanics and it feels great to do all of these crazy kills. And the result of that is that you end up with this high chaos outcome, this high chaos narrative. But the fact that it responds to you in that way, be it because you're trying to tell a certain story or you're just playing a certain way, and that in itself is telling a certain story, is a thing that is also quite unique to games. You don't get to say, when you engage with other types of media, be it a comic book or a film or a novel, unless it's choose your own adventure, my character would do this, or they would make these decisions, or they would play this situation in this way, and have that reflected. And I think this is something that we talked about the other day, about how in some of those other forms, some of those things come from once you've got to the end of it. Once you've finished watching a film or finished reading a book, you can then think back on the things that have happened and create this version of a character in your head that would then have a life beyond that self-contained example. Whereas in games, that can happen on the fly. And I think that's an interesting distinction. And the power of games in that way is that you don't have to get to the end of it to then kind of give your character their own life effectively. You can do that whilst you're playing the game. Yeah,
and that is an interesting thing about games. I think that I don't want to say it's more or less powerful, because I don't think it is. I don't think it is more or less powerful than waiting until the end of something and then
it's different.
Inferring it. Yeah, it's different. I think where that works best is actually on, again, something that's quite unique to games, is that the protagonists are hollow characters, right? They're nothing. Like they're
Do you think that works best in the games in which they are like ciphers, you mean?
As opposed to they're just physical embodiments of the player's actions, essentially. Something like Link from Zelda, like, characters that don't really have like much to say. They don't. The meaning of the game isn't delivered through them. They're just like your guide through the world, and they're your sword and your shield, basically. The meaning comes from how you're interpreting the actions that you're giving them, and possibly how other characters are reacting to them in the game. Because that's quite unique as well in books or films, that you don't have characters who are just nothing, who are just waiting for people to, the viewer to tell them what to do. Like, how would that work? I think that works. Characters being just sort of hollow works if you want to tell if a player wants to tell their version of a narrative and they want to role play as that, just wide open, do whatever you want. This is how I'm going to imprint myself on this world, then you kind of need to have a shell character, because otherwise, if the character's got too many lines, if the character's too authored, if the character has too much to say about the world in which they live in, then you're going to be interpreting your play of that through the cipher of them. It's going to be filtered through their worldview. So it's not just going to be a blank slate in which I will now make Link a goodie, a baddie, a indifferent, or whatever. Like, you can't do that if the character has their own opinions about what's happening in the world.
There is a halfway house with that. I think with something like The Witcher, perhaps, or a game in which there is a very authored character who has a distinct voice, but can use that distinct voice to comment on the things that you are doing as the player. And there's a version of him, there's a version of Geralt that has an opinion based on, whatever it is you're doing. And also because often your actions can be interpreted in different ways. It's your intent and the actual outcome can be two different things in The Witcher specifically, because you might intend to do this for wholly good reasons, and this is my intention, but that will be taken and potentially often twisted in such a way that there's a gotcha at the end of it, or there's a thing, an unforeseen thing, and then Geralt comments on that, or has to deal with that, or has to deal with the characters around him, getting on him for doing a certain thing.
Yeah, and I think that is a halfway house, but I still think that the Geralt character is still a very authored character, no matter what the player does. Because he still has a certain personality, he still has people react to him in a certain way, he still fights with a sword and shield, he's still got these powers. He's still got a history, so all of those things are there, cast iron, set in stone. So any interpretation that you're making is with those elements in firm place. They cannot be, be removed. They can't be changed.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Geralt is he's a monster hunter, a monster slayer. Like there isn't a version of Geralt where he's a baker or
no, exactly. It'd be hard to play him as like a pacifist. Because then you're removing a huge part of the game, so you can't kind of imprint that bit on him. But yeah, like I think you don't need to like the whole idea about like what kind of character you are. So the fact that like he's got a sword and a shield and a horse, like kind of reminds me. So
Geralt doesn't have a shield, but
he's got two swords and a horse.
Makes all the difference,
and some nice eyes.
Luscious hair.
Yeah. So, but like that idea of like sort of some of these basic elements that you have, and like what does that tell us about the world and the character before we even begin making implications about or inferences about what's happening. And the context in which is what's happening. So I always think about Shadow of Colossus in this way. So before you even begin playing that game, you've got a sword and a shield. Have you even got a shield? Maybe you're not. You've got a sword and a helmet.
You got a sword.
You got a helmet.
You need your other hand. For
you got a helmet.
Colossus.
You got a helmet and a sword and a horse. And it's in this fantastical world, and it's all
you've been playing too much Demon Souls.
Giant. Just sort of, buildings and whatever, or a couple of giant buildings, a couple of giant constructs that's got that big bridge and whatever, and this sort of fantasy world. So before you even start playing that, there's, fantasy of that sort of high fantasy has conditioned us to believe that we're going to be subjected to, chivalry and acts of bravery and courage and, men saving damsels.
Quintessential good guy.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
you're
an
old-fashioned hero.
And,
you're like St. George
yeah.
saving the maiden or the villagers from the dragon, like basically. And the plot is to save this, and then surprisingly enough, the plot is a bit male trying to find a way to save a female, and they've gone into the Forbidden Lands to do it, and is doing it for love, right? Like what more grand reason do you need? What more simple and both simple and grand reason do you need than love? Like very sort of old fantasy, sort of biblical idea. But then the more you play, like the actions, and then your actions in the game sort of like mirror those old fantasy things. You're fighting giant monsters. So it's like how could this small persons and a comparatively meek weapons and their horse companion possibly overcome this? Well, the power of love will do it. But then sort of the undertones of that game, what's being in the implicit narrative when I play that, and it's like one of my favorite games, for me is, well, actually what the game's asking you, really, what you're taking as, or what I'm taking when I play that is, and I'm killing all of these sort of monsters, Colossus, that haven't really done anything wrong, really. They just seem to be living, and then when you turn up with a sword and a horse running around, to get up and it's like, what's happening? And then you jump on them and you kill them.
Unsurprisingly, they try to defend themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
So surely the question in that game then, what can be implied there is that it's asking you as a player all of these actions that you're going for, all these typical fancy actions to save your dying love, is actually, are we not performing evil here in order to save someone? So then therefore is the idea of loving someone unconditionally to the point where you do anything for them, does that not just open you up to doing evil things? So when I'm playing that game, I'm well beyond the point of feeling guilt for the Colossus now, but like there is a point halfway through that game where it's like, hang on a minute, like is the life of this one person, yes, you might love them, but is this actually a fair deal? Like, is this trade-off fair for just morality for the world?
So that's where that dichotomy that sometimes can be jarring of what you're doing and what you're being told you're doing, and that doesn't match up, and that feels jarring. That's a very good example, perhaps one of the kind of seminal examples of using that, subverting that exact dichotomy of the reason that you're doing this. It's meant to be this incredibly holy, incredibly like pure reason for doing this, and the things that you're doing, they clash. And the more you play the game, and I think because you're not explicitly told, there's no reinforcement, you're not explicitly told that you're doing the right thing, keep going, you only need to kill 3 more of them and you'll get you'll get to the goal. There isn't NPCs saying that, there isn't like it's quite passive.
There's the voice in the sky.
I mean, like it's a passive experience, as in judgment isn't being cast on you in terms of like, doing great things or you're doing terrible things. So then you're given room to think about it, and then the more you think about it, the more you think, hang on, this isn't.
Yeah, and then I think, and then the game's quite clever. I think, or it's quite impactful anyway. In even when you're thinking about these things, like the only way to progress is to continue killing them. So you can't ever then get away from this moral conundrum that you're having in your own mind. So the game, you could almost read the game as a criticism of both those the fantasy elements that the sword and the horse and the world and the damsel in distress sort of play into. It's a critique on that, well, no, we will just continue headlong. We will, no matter what, we will continue headlong into here. It doesn't just like these sort of any of these doubts that we're having about these sort of purity of our actions are pointless because the only way we can progress is by ignoring them. And then it might even be a criticism of like a sort of satire on games themselves, in that you are told this is your mission, it's pure, get on with it. And any kind of, if you try to not do that, and you try to, if you just stop shooting your gun in Gears of War, and it's like, actually, should we, like the locusts, should we just see like if we can coexist? Like the game will not continue. The world of the game will end. And that's what happens in Shadow of the Colossus as well. Like it just won't continue. So I mean that's one of my favorite examples of like implied.
And so all of this I think illustrates the power that game narrative can potentially have. All of it illustrates this explicit narrative. What is you're explicitly told, what is implied, and what you infer from that, or from the mechanics or the framework that you're interacting with and existing in. And it would be, I think there's a lot more that you can get from games by just, I don't know, like every now and then just stopping and thinking a bit more about this, like thinking, well, how do I feel about this? Like, okay, yes, I've killed the bad guys, or like there's just more that can be. It's quite a rich vein of additional satisfaction that can be taken.
Yeah,
by spending that time just kind of thinking about it and thinking about why you're doing these things and what your actions versus what you're being told, how those two things are interacting.
Yeah.
Are they deliberately causing a dissonance? Is it accidental? Are they in harmony? How does that make you feel? I think there's a lot that can be taken from that, both as players and also on the other side, thinking about it as designers.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because I think there's obviously a lot of meat to get into on how having the explicit and the implied narratives kind of play into each other is really powerful. But it's one of those things that you can still gain huge satisfaction from it without necessarily thinking about it. Because I'm thinking again, like Last of Us, it's really powerful. The game's powerful because those two things work in tandem, even if you're not explicitly aware of what's happening. But there's just, that overall sense of it is just empowered and buffed. I guess it's one of those things that you realize how important it is through the examples that just do it badly. And and that really has
the
ruined
extremes,
it.
I think. Yeah. I think probably, you notice it more when something doesn't work. And so, yes, in that instance, in that way, the sort of the poorer examples of it. But then when you have the highs of it as well, that gives contrast. And of course it's then you have something to compare it to, and it can help you help you see more than you would if it was just never quite working.
Yeah. And it just helps you understand why you like it, like why was that, helps you understand what it is that you liked about that, which I suppose will help you seek out more things that match that. If you understand why you like something, that helps you seek out more of it, doesn't it? Like, as a most basic
you can
level.
enjoy stuff more because it's like, I want more of that, or I specifically want a break from that, or I want X, Y, or Z in relation to the thing that I've just experienced and felt. And that's a powerful thing.
Thank you for listening. Do get in touch with us on Twitter if you've got your own thoughts on implicit and explicit narrative as they exist in video games. We are at Indie by Design. And also do take a moment to leave us a nice review on iTunes if you like the show and you want it to reach more people. And finally, don't forget to check out our website, indiebydesign.net, where you can browse the video game books that we write and publish. Right now, you can grab yourself a copy of Oddworld Abe's Origins, just in time for Oddworld Soulstorm's release this April, and you can get yourself a copy of 20 Double Fine Years ready for Psychonauts 2's release later this year. Both books are officially licensed by their respective studios, meaning we've had incredible access to interviewees and our archives. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.